Welcome to our deep dive today. You ready to learn about early English settlements in America?
I am.
Great. I'm really excited about this one. I think our listeners are going to find this really fascinating.
Yeah, I think so too.
They're interested in those first English colonies, and we're going to try to unpack, like how they began, their challenges, some of the key figures involved.
Right.
We've got a really interesting chapter here from a historical text, and I think we're going to be in for some surprises.
Yeah, there's always surprises when you dig into history.
Always. I mean, like, just from glancing at this, we're talking about, like, a lost colony and cannibalism,
Oh, wow.
a rebellious farmer, and a woman banished for challenging religious norms.
I mean, it sounds like a historical drama.
Yeah, it really does. But these stories are very real.
They are.
And they reveal so much about, how complex the forces were that shaped early America.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's kind of start with the big picture here. Like,
Yeah.
if we're imagining these early settlements,
hmm
what are we talking about?
Well, you can kind of think of them like small, fragile communities clinging to the edge of a vast wilderness.
Okay.
Most of the people were English immigrants, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity. But these weren't all like wealthy adventurers.
Right.
Many arrived as indentured servants, basically working off their passage in exchange for, a chance at a new life.
And that's a good reminder that the American dream, even back then, wasn't always equally accessible.
Exactly.
Right.
And this period also saw this gradual but really profound shift from indentured servitude to African slavery,
Hmm.
a change that would obviously have a devastating impact on the colony's future.
Yeah, and of course, we can't forget about the Native Americans who were already here.
Right.
What was their relationship like with these English settlers?
It was incredibly complex, marked by moments of peaceful interaction and trade, but also periods of intense conflict over land and resources.
Hmm.
I mean, that clash of cultures is really key to understanding, how these early settlements developed.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we have a picture of these small, struggling communities,
Right.
mix of English immigrants,
hmm
beginnings of slavery,
hmm
complicated relationship with Native Americans. Where do we even start?
No, I think a good place to start is in the Chesapeake region,
Okay.
with a mystery that's haunted historians for centuries. The lost colony of Roanoke.
Oh, a mystery. I knew we were going to get to that one.
Uh-huh.
What happened?
Well, in the late 1580s, Roanoke Island, which is off the coast of what's now North Carolina, was the site of England's first attempt at a permanent settlement in North America.
Oh.
Families arrived, they built homes, and then they vanished.
They vanished, like, completely.
Yeah, there were a few clues, including the word Croatoan carved into a post,
Uh-huh.
but the fate of the Roanoke colonists is still a puzzle to this day.
That's so creepy but fascinating at the same time.
Mm.
So after this mysterious disappearance, did the English just give up?
No, not at all.
Okay.
In 1607, they established Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in the Chesapeake Bay region. But those early years were brutal.
You mean brutal?
Disease, starvation.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly, there's even evidence of cannibalism during a particularly harsh winter.
Cannibalism. Wow, okay, I'm starting to see where the drama comes in.
Mm-hmm.
How did Jamestown manage to survive all of that?
It was a struggle, but the discovery of tobacco as a cash crop eventually brought prosperity to Jamestown and the surrounding area.
Okay.
However, this economic success came with a dark side.
Uh-oh.
In 1619, the first Africans arrived in Jamestown.
And this marks the beginning of slavery's long and tragic chapter in American history.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
So they initially arrived as indentured servants.
That's right, just like many of the English settlers.
But the growing demand for labor on tobacco plantations led to that rapid shift towards chattel slavery.
Right.
And by the late 1600s, the enslaved population in Virginia had just exploded.
It had.
And this wasn't just a matter of practice, it
Hmm.
was actually codified into law.
Right. In 1662, a law was passed stating that children of enslaved mothers would also be enslaved for life. Wow.
This made slavery a hereditary institution in Virginia, a turning point with really devastating consequences.
So in just a few decades, we see a lost colony, a struggling settlement that finds a profitable but morally corrupt path, and the legal foundation for centuries of slavery. That's a lot to process.
It is a stark reminder of how quickly things can change and how economic interests can intertwine with human suffering.
Yeah.
And these tensions would eventually erupt in a dramatic rebellion that shook the colony to its core. Bacon's Rebellion.
Okay, let's talk about this rebellion. Who was Bacon and what sparked this uprising?
Well, beneath Jamestown's economic success, there were social tensions that were simmering.
Okay.
Wealthy planters held most of the land of the power,
Right?
leaving poor whites with few opportunities.
That sounds like a recipe for resentment and unrest.
Exactly. And on top of that, there was this constant conflict with Native Americans over land. It was a powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
So Nathaniel Bacon was that spark. Well, he was a charismatic and ambitious figure who emerged to channel that discontent. He united a diverse group of colonists, small farmers, landless men, indentured servants, and even some Africans against the colonial government.
Wow, okay. So what were they fighting for? What did they want?
They demanded lower taxes, a voice in government, and access to land. They wanted an end to what they saw as the corrupt rule of the wealthy elite.
So did they succeed? Did they bring about the changes that they demanded?
The rebellion itself was ultimately unsuccessful.
Okay.
Bacon died of dysentery and his followers were defeated. However, Bacon's rebellion did have a lasting impact on Virginia.
What were the long-term consequences of this failed rebellion?
Well, for one, it pushed the colonial government to open up more Native American land to white settlers,
Wow.
which only escalated those conflicts. But it also played a crucial role in solidifying the system of racial slavery.
So how did a rebellion against the elite end up strengthening slavery?
Because it exposed the deep racial anxieties at the heart of colonial society, white indentured servants, even if they rebelled, could eventually gain their freedom and become landowners.
But enslaved Africans had no such hope.
Exactly. The rebellion highlighted that stark difference, making it easier for the elite to exploit those racial divisions. They could offer concessions to poor whites while further entrenching the system of slavery that kept Africans permanently powerless.
So Bacon's rebellion, while a failure in the short term, had these lasting consequences that would shape the social and racial landscape of Virginia for generations to come.
Absolutely. It's a pivotal moment in understanding how slavery became so deeply embedded in the American colonies.
Wow, so much drama and intrigue in just this first section of our deep dive.
Right.
From a lost colony to this brutal struggle for survival to a rebellion that had really unintended consequences. The Chesapeake region offers a glimpse into the complexities of these early English settlements in North America.
It does, and it sets the stage for exploring the different motivations and challenges that shaped other colonies.
That's right, listeners. We're headed north to New England next, where the world of the Puritans and Pilgrims awaits. Get ready for stories of religious fervor, strict social codes, and their own unique interactions with Native Americans. Stay tuned, because things are about to get really interesting. Okay, so we're leaving the drama of Jamestown and Bacon's rebellion behind for a bit.
Right?
We're venturing into the world of Puritans and Pilgrims in New England.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating how different their motivations were compared to the settlers we just talked about in the Chesapeake.
Absolutely. In New England, religion was the driving force.
Okay.
These weren't just people seeking land or wealth.
Right.
They were driven by this fervent desire to create a society that aligned with their very strict religious beliefs.
Okay, so let's break it down. Who were these Puritans and what made them so different?
Well, the term Puritan came from their desire to purify the Church of England.
Okay.
They felt the church was too closely tied to the Catholic Church. And they wanted to simplify worship and focus on this more direct relationship with God.
Okay.
They were also deeply influenced by the teachings of John Calvin,
Mm-hmm.
who emphasized predestination, the idea that God had already chosen who would be saved.
So they were pretty serious about their faith.
Mm.
But why leave England altogether? Couldn't they just, practice their own form of religion there?
Well, they faced a lot of persecution in England.
Oh, okay.
They were seen as radical and disruptive, and many were imprisoned or fined for their beliefs.
Wow.
So they felt they had no choice but to seek a new land
Okay.
where they could practice their faith freely and build a society based on their own principles.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And this is where the Pilgrims come in, right? Those brave souls who set sail on the Mayflower?
Exactly. In 1620, a group of Puritans known as the Pilgrims embarked on the Mayflower determined to establish a new life in America.
Okay.
It is important to note, though, that not everyone on board was a devout Puritan.
really?
They brought others along, skilled tradespeople and families who were simply seeking a fresh start.
Ah. So even back then, America was attracting a diverse mix of people. But what about that famous Mayflower Compact? What was so special about that document?
You can think of it as the very first written framework for government in what would become the United States.
Yep.
These settlers, before they even set foot on land, agreed to create laws for the common good and to abide by them.
That's amazing, right? They were laying the groundwork for self-governance and democracy.
Exactly, and it's an idea that would echo through the centuries, shaping the very foundation of American political thought.
Okay, so they landed Plymouth. They have their framework for government. What happens next? Life in the New World couldn't have been easy.
No survival was the first and most urgent challenge.
Right.
The Pilgrims landed in December,
Oh, no.
facing a harsh winter. They wouldn't have made it without the help of the Wampanoag tribe.
Yes, the story of Squanto and the first Thanksgiving.
That's right. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims essential survival skills.
Mm.
How to plant crops, how to fish, how to navigate this unfamiliar land.
Right.
And in a moment of unity and gratitude, they shared that first Thanksgiving feast.
It's such a heartwarming story.
Mm.
But as you mentioned earlier, the relationship between colonists and Native Americans was really complex.
It was.
This was just one chapter in a story that would often be marked by conflict and tragedy.
Sadly, that's true. But for the Pilgrims, that first winter solidified their determination to build a new life in Plymouth.
Okay.
Under the leadership of Governor William Bradford, the colony grew. Within a decade, the population reached 300.
So Plymouth was a success.
In terms of survival and growth, yes. But Plymouth was just one piece of the Puritan puzzle in New England.
Oh.
There was a much larger and more ambitious settlement on the horizon,
Okay.
the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Okay, let's talk about Massachusetts Bay. What made this colony different from Plymouth?
Well, for starters, it was on a much grander scale. In 1630, a fleet of 17 ships carrying over 1,000 Puritan settlers arrived,
Wow.
led by a man named John Winthrop.
Wow, that's a lot of people. It sounds like they had a big vision for this colony.
They did. John Winthrop believed they were building more than just a settlement.
Okay.
He famously described it as a city upon a hill, a model Christian society that would be a beacon of righteousness for the world to see.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
So did they succeed in creating this utopian city upon a hill?
Well, they certainly tried. They established a theocracy,
Okay.
a system of government where the church and state were closely intertwined.
Right.
Religious law governed nearly every aspect of life.
That sounds intense.
Mm.
Not exactly the kind of freedom most people associate with America today.
No, and not surprisingly, this strict control led to dissent and conflict.
Yeah.
Not everyone wanted to live in such a rigid society. Some people began to challenge the authority of the Puritan leaders.
So what happened to those who disagreed?
Some were banished, forced to leave the colony and find new homes elsewhere.
Okay.
Others decided to stay and fight for change from within. And this dissent, this desire for greater freedom, led to the founding of new colonies in New England, like Rhode Island and Connecticut.
So Massachusetts Bay, while influential, also planted the seeds for its own fragmentation.
Exactly. It's a recurring theme in this era. The desire for freedom, whether religious, economic, or political,
Right.
often led to the creation of new settlements, further expanding that colonial landscape.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Now, before we get into those other New England colonies, I'm curious about Maryland.
Okay.
It stands out because it was founded as a haven for Catholics,
Right.
which seems unusual in this era of such strong Protestant beliefs.
You're right. Maryland was established in the 1630s by Cecil Calvert,
Okay.
the second Lord Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Catholic, and he wanted to create a colony where Catholics could practice their faith freely
Okay.
without facing the persecution they experienced in England.
So religious motivation wasn't exclusive to the Puritans in New England.
Not at all. And Maryland, while economically similar to Virginia with its reliance on tobacco,
Right.
also aimed to foster religious tolerance.
Okay.
They even passed the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649.
That sounds like a major step towards religious freedom in the colonies.
It was, but it's important to note that this act only extended to Christians.
Okay.
Jews and those of other faiths were still excluded.
Still, it's a significant development, especially considering the religious strife that was so common in Europe at the time.
Absolutely. It set a precedent for greater acceptance of different Christian denominations,
Right.
paving the way for greater religious diversity in the colonies.
Speaking of religious freedom, we can't forget about Roger Williams and the founding of Rhode Island.
Right.
He was a real advocate for separating church and state, wasn't he?
He was a truly radical figure for his time.
Yeah.
Roger Williams was a minister
Okay.
who believed that forcing people to conform to a particular religion was wrong.
Okay.
He also argued passionately for the rights of Native Americans,
Mm.
which put him at odds with the Puritan leadership in Massachusetts Bay.
It sounds like his views were way ahead of his time. What happened to him?
He was banished from Massachusetts Bay for his dangerous opinions.
Oh, wow. So what did he do?
He didn't give up on his ideals. He found refuge with the Narragansett tribe
Okay.
and established Providence in 1636.
Okay.
He secured a charter for Rhode Island in 1644,
Okay.
and this colony became a haven for religious dissenters.
So people who were kicked out of Massachusetts Bay for their beliefs could find a home in Rhode Island.
Exactly. Rhode Island welcomed people of all faiths.
Wow.
Baptists, Quakers, Jews. It was a beacon of religious freedom.
Yeah.
A stark contrast to the strict Puritan control in Massachusetts Bay.
And it wasn't just Roger Williams challenging those Puritan norms. There was also Anne Hutchinson.
Ah, yes, Anne Hutchinson. She's another fascinating figure. She was a well-respected woman in Boston,
Okay.
and she held meetings in her home to discuss religious ideas. But her interpretations of Scripture differed from the Puritan leaders.
So what made her teaching so controversial?
She argued that individuals could have a direct relationship with God
Right.
without the need for ministers or the church hierarchy.
Right.
This was a radical idea that challenged the authority of the Puritan elite.
I can see why that would have ruffled some feathers. What happened to her?
She was put on trial for heresy,
Oh, well.
and like Roger Williams, she was banished from Massachusetts Bay.
So she also found her way to Rhode Island.
She did. She and her followers settled near Providence,
Okay.
further contributing to the colony's reputation for religious tolerance. And her legacy lived on, inspiring others to challenge religious orthodoxy.
Wow. These stories of Williams and Hutchinson are amazing. They show that even in this era of strict religious beliefs, there were people willing to stand up and fight for individual conscience
Right.
and the right to think differently.
They're true pioneers of religious freedom in America. Their courage helped shape the diverse and pluralistic society that we value today.
But amidst these stories of religious debate and the founding of new colonies, we can't forget about those ongoing tensions with Native Americans.
Sadly, that's true. And the next chapter in our story takes us to a particularly brutal conflict,
Okay.
King Philip's War.
I've heard of King Philip's War, but I don't know much about it. What caused this conflict?
Well, tensions over land, resources, and cultural differences had been simmering for decades.
Okay.
The Wampanoag, led by Chief Metacom, known to the English as King Philip,
Okay.
saw their ancestral lands shrinking, their way of life threatened, and they decided to resist further English expansion.
So King Philip became this symbol of Native American resistance against colonial encroachment.
Exactly. He formed an alliance with other tribes, the Narragansett and the Nipmuc,
Okay.
and in 1675, war erupted.
So how did this war impact the colonies?
It was devastating for both sides. It raged for over a year.
Wow.
Brutal fighting throughout New England. Villages were burned. People were killed.
Yeah.
The landscape of the region was forever altered.
What was the outcome of the war?
In 1676, Metacom was killed, and the Native American resistance was crushed.
Okay.
The war ended in a decisive colonial victory, but it came at a terrible cost.
What do you mean? What was the cost of this victory?
Thousands of Native Americans were killed or sold into slavery. The Wampanoag and their allies were decimated, their power broken.
Wow.
And for the colonists, it was a Pyrrhic victory.
Okay.
Their economy was shattered, and the war left a legacy of fear and resentment that would linger for generations.
It's a tragic reminder that the expansion of the English colonies came at a huge human cost.
It's a dark chapter in American history, one that we can't ignore as we explore the complexities of this era.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in New England,
But yeah,
from the Pilgrims' arrival in Plymouth
right?
to the religious fervor of Massachusetts Bay and the tragic conflict of King Philip's War.
Yeah.
It's clear that this region played a pivotal role in shaping that early American identity.
It did, and it set the stage for the growth of new colonies, each with its own unique story to tell.
That's right. We're moving on to explore the Restoration colonies, those settlements that emerged after a period of upheaval and change in England. We'll dive into the stories of the Carolinas, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and the unique Quaker settlement of Pennsylvania. Stay tuned, listeners, because we're just getting started. All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into the first English colonies. You know, so far we've seen the struggles and triumphs of Jamestown, the religious fervor of New England,
Right.
and the just tragic clashes with Native Americans.
Yeah.
But there's more to explore. We're going to talk about the Restoration colonies,
Okay.
which emerged after some pretty dramatic events back in England.
That's right. The English Civil War and the subsequent restoration of the monarchy really had this ripple effect across the Atlantic, leading to the establishment of new colonies and shaping the future of English America.
Okay, so before we dive into those specific colonies, can you just give me a quick recap?
Sure.
What was this English Civil War all about,
Okay.
and how did it impact the colonies?
Well, imagine this power struggle between the king and parliament.
Right.
In the 1640s, King Charles I tried to assert his authority,
Hmm.
and he clashed with Parliament over taxes and religious reforms.
Okay.
And this conflict escalated into a full-blown civil war,
Wow.
with the country divided between those who supported the king and those who sided with Parliament.
So it was this battle for control for who would hold the real power in England.
Exactly. And the outcome of this war had significant consequences for the colonies.
Such a...
Well, for example, during the war, Parliament actually gained more control over colonial affairs.
Okay.
But once the monarchy was restored,
Mm.
the king reasserted his authority.
So how did this back and forth impact the development of these new restoration colonies?
Well, for one thing, the English Civil War delayed further colonization efforts.
Okay.
But once Charles II was restored to the throne, he was eager to expand England's influence and reassert control over the colonies.
Mhm.
He granted charters for new settlements, including Carolina, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania.
So these are the restoration colonies, each reflecting the political and social changes happening back in England. Exactly. Let's start with the Carolinas. What was the motivation behind establishing colonies in this region?
Well, in the 1660s, a group of English proprietors received a grant for this vast territory south of Virginia.
Right.
And their goal was twofold: to counter Spanish expansion in Florida
Right.
and to create a profitable colony based on agriculture.
Strategic and economic ambitions, a familiar combination in these colonial ventures.
Yeah.
So how did the settlement of the Carolinas actually play out?
Well, the first permanent English settlement was established in 1670 at Charlestown,
Okay.
later renamed Charleston.
Right.
The location was strategic, offering access to a good harbor and fertile land.
Charleston. Even today, it's known for its history and charm.
Mm.
I'm curious, those proprietors who envisioned this colony,
Mm.
what kind of society did they have in mind?
They were determined to establish this rigid social hierarchy
Okay.
outlined in a document called the Fundamental Constitutions of 1669. At the top, of course, were the proprietors themselves,
Right.
followed by a landed aristocracy.
Okay.
Then came the ordinary settlers.
Mm-hmm.
Below them, poor whites with limited rights.
Right.
And at the very bottom, enslaved Africans.
That sounds like a very stratified society with slavery just built into its very foundation.
Sadly, yes, the Carolinas from the outset were heavily influenced by the plantation system of the West Indies, relying on enslaved African labor to cultivate crops like rice and indigo.
So the Carolinas were shaped by both their geographic location, as a buffer against Spanish Florida,
Right.
and by their economic reliance on slavery. Did this lead to any internal divisions within the colony?
Absolutely. Over time, tensions grew between the wealthy planters in the South,
Okay.
who dominated the economy,
Right.
and the small farmers in the North, who resented that power.
Right.
And these divisions eventually led to the colony splitting into two: North Carolina and South Carolina.
A division that really foreshadowed those larger conflicts that would eventually tear the nation apart. Okay, let's shift gears. Head north to the mid-Atlantic colonies. What was happening in this region?
Well, the story of New York starts with a power shift.
Oh.
In 1664, the English seized control of the Dutch colony of New Netherland,
Yep.
renaming it New York after the Duke of York.
So a change in ownership with far-reaching consequences.
Definitely, New York became this melting pot of cultures.
Okay.
It was home to not only the Dutch and English,
Right.
but also Scandinavians, Germans, French Huguenots,
Mm-hmm.
and a sizable population of Africans, both free and enslaved.
That's incredible. So New York had this incredible diversity right from the start.
It did, and this mix of cultures influenced everything from its architecture to its cuisine to its legal system.
Wow.
And speaking of its legal system, there's this fascinating aspect of early New York's history related to slavery.
Okay.
The Dutch had this unique system called half-freedom.
Half freedom. What does that mean?
It was a status somewhere between slavery and freedom.
Okay.
Certain enslaved Africans in New Netherland had been granted half-freedom, which allowed them to work for wages, own property, and even have their marriages recognized by law.
Well,
However, their children remained enslaved.
it sounds like a step toward recognizing the humanity of enslaved people,
Yeah.
but it still perpetuated that institution of slavery.
Exactly. It was a complex and contradictory system,
Right.
reflecting the moral ambiguities surrounding slavery during this period.
And what about New Jersey? What made this colony unique?
New Jersey was similar to New York in its diversity,
Okay.
attracting settlers from various European countries. However, unlike New York,
Mm-hmm.
it lacked a dominant landowning class.
Okay.
This meant that there wasn't this powerful elite controlling vast tracts of land
Mm.
and dictating the colony's economic and political life.
So a more egalitarian society.
To a certain extent, yes, the absence of a powerful aristocracy really shaped New Jersey's development,
Okay.
fostering a greater sense of social mobility and opportunity for
Right.
those who weren't part of the wealthy elite.
That's interesting. Now, we can't forget about Pennsylvania, a colony founded by a group known for their pacifism and tolerance, the Quakers.
Ah, Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
It's a remarkable story of how religious ideals could shape the founding and development of a colony.
Right.
The Quakers, officially known as the Religious Society of Friends,
Mm-hmm.
held beliefs that really set them apart from other religious groups in the colonies.
What made the Quakers so different? What did they believe?
They believed in the inherent goodness of all people.
Oh.
They emphasized equality, pacifism, and a direct relationship with God.
Okay.
Without the need for formal ministers or rituals,
Right.
these beliefs led them to reject violence and war
Mm.
and to advocate for fair treatment of all people, including Native Americans.
Those are pretty radical ideas for the 17th century.
They were.
How did these beliefs translate into the founding of Pennsylvania?
In 1681, William Penn, a prominent Quaker, received a land grant from King Charles II.
Okay.
He envisioned Pennsylvania as this holy experiment, a place where people of different faiths could live together in peace and harmony.
Right.
He was determined to create a society based on those Quaker principles of tolerance, justice, and respect for all.
It sounds like Penn was trying to create a utopia, this model society,
He was.
that contrasted sharply with the often harsh realities of colonial life.
Right.
Did he succeed?
Well, Pennsylvania, like all colonies, faced its share of challenges, but Penn's vision had a profound impact.
Okay.
He insisted on treating Native Americans fairly,
Oh.
purchasing land from them rather than taking it by force.
That's big.
He established a representative assembly,
Mhm.
giving colonists a voice in government,
Okay.
and Pennsylvania attracted a diverse population,
Right.
including many immigrants from Germany and other parts of Europe.
So Pennsylvania became known as this haven for those seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity.
It did. It became the most cosmopolitan of the English colonies,
Okay.
a testament to Penn's vision of a tolerant and inclusive society.
Okay, we've explored a lot of colonies.
We have.
Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Maryland, Rhode Island, the Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania.
It's a lot.
Our journey through these early English settlements concludes with the last of the 13 colonies, Georgia.
Right.
What about Georgia?
Georgia's story is unique.
Mm.
It was established in 1732,
Okay.
much later than the other colonies,
Mhm.
and it had a very specific purpose to serve as a military buffer,
Okay.
protecting the southern colonies from Spanish Florida.
So strategic concerns were paramount.
Absolutely. James Oglethorpe,
Okay.
a philanthropist and military leader,
Hmm.
received a charter from King George II to establish this new colony.
Okay.
And he envisioned Georgia as a place where England's worthy poor could start anew,
Okay.
free from debtors' prisons.
So it was meant to be a refuge for those who had fallen on hard times.
Yes, and Oglethorpe had some very specific ideas about how this colony should be run.
Okay.
He banned hard liquor, outlawed slavery,
Wow.
and limited the size of land holdings. He wanted to create a society of small, independent farmers,
Right.
a kind of yeoman republic.
That's pretty progressive considering the prevalence of slavery in those neighboring colonies.
It was, but Oglethorpe's vision faced resistance.
Oh, okay.
The colonists wanted the freedom to own slaves and to acquire larger tracts of land.
So did Oglethorpe's grand experiment fail?
In the end, yes, slavery was legalized in Georgia in 1751,
Yep.
and large plantations began to emerge. The colony, like its neighbors, became increasingly reliant on enslaved African labor to drive its economy.
So Georgia's story mirrors those broader trends of colonial development, shaped by economic ambition, the allure of land, and the tragic embrace of slavery.
It does, but it's also a reminder that even within the framework of colonialism, there were people like Oglethorpe who tried to create a more just and equitable society.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to revisit a theme that has run through our entire conversation:
Okay.
the relationship between colonists and Native Americans.
It's a crucial aspect of colonial history, one that we can't overlook.
You know, earlier you mentioned the concept of middle grounds.
I did.
Can you explain what that means?
In certain regions, particularly along the western frontiers of English settlement, There were areas where neither Europeans nor Native Americans held complete control.
Okay.
These middle grounds were spaces of interaction, negotiation, and sometimes conflict, where both sides had to adapt and make concessions to coexist.
So it wasn't always a clear-cut case of conquest and domination.
Not at all in these middle grounds. Colonists and Native Americans engaged in trade, diplomacy, and even intermarriage.
Wow.
They formed alliances sometimes against other European powers or rival tribes. It was a complex and fluid dynamic
Right.
shaped by shifting power balances and mutual needs.
But ultimately, European expansion continued to encroach on Native American lands, didn't it?
Yes, sadly. And this expansion inevitably led to further conflict and displacement of Native American populations.
It's a reminder that the story of the English colonies is not just about the triumphs and challenges faced by the colonists themselves.
Right.
It's also about the impact of their arrival on the people who were already here.
Absolutely. The story of English settlement in North America is intricately intertwined with the story of Native Americans. And we need to understand both to have a complete picture of this era.
Okay, as we reach the end of our deep dive into the first English colonies,
Right.
I'm struck by how much we've covered.
It's a lot.
From those first tentative settlements
Yeah.
to the struggles for survival, the religious fervor, the economic ambitions, and the tragic legacy of slavery. It's a complex and fascinating story.
It is, and it's a story that laid the foundation for the nation that would eventually emerge.
Before we say goodbye, I want to touch on one more aspect of this history, the economic policies
Okay.
that shaped the relationship between England and its American colonies.
You're talking about mercantilism and the Navigation Acts.
Exactly. Can you remind us what those were all about?
Mercantilism was the prevailing economic theory in Europe at the time. It viewed colonies as existing primarily to benefit the mother country.
Right.
Colonies were supposed to provide raw materials and serve as markets for finished goods produced back in England.
So the colonies were essentially seen as economic assets,
Yeah.
meant to enrich England.
That's the basic idea. And to enforce this system of control, England passed a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts,
Okay.
starting in the 1650s.
How did those Navigation Acts impact the colonies? What did they actually do?
Well, they imposed restrictions on colonial trade.
Okay.
Colonies could only export certain goods to England, and they had to use English ships.
Okay.
The goal was to ensure that England controlled the flow of goods and profits from its colonial empire.
I can see how that would create resentment. Weren't the colonists supposed to have the same rights as Englishmen?
They were, and that's where the conflict arose.
Okay.
The colonists increasingly saw these restrictions as unfair
Yeah.
and a violation of their rights. They wanted the freedom to trade with whomever they wanted and to develop their own economies.
So these Navigation Acts were a major source of tension between the colonies and England.
They were, and these tensions would only grow in the decades that followed.
Well, we've covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah.
From the founding of Jamestown to the Navigation Acts. We've seen how these early English settlements were shaped by this complex mix of motivations: religious freedom, economic opportunity, political ambition, and just the desire for a better life.
We've also seen the resilience and determination of the colonists.
Right.
Their struggles for survival, their successes and failures.
And we've also seen the tragic consequences of their arrival for Native Americans.
Yes.
And the enduring legacy of slavery. It's a complex and multifaceted story, one that continues to shape our understanding of America today.
It is a story that reminds us that the past is never truly past. It shapes who we are and the challenges we face.
You know, as you continue to explore this fascinating period in American history, I'll leave you with this one final thought. What if those Roanoke colonists had survived?
Ooh.
How would their presence have changed the course of events?
That's a great question. It highlights the unpredictable nature of history
Right.
and the enduring mystery of that lost colony.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into early English settlements in America. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and come away with a deeper understanding of those first colonies that laid the foundation for our nation.